Հարգելի ընկերներ, այսօր մեր հյուրն է դոկտոր Arta Moeini-ն։ Պարոն Moeini-ն հետազոտությունների տնօրեն է Վաշինգտոնի Խաղաղության եւ Դիվանագիտության ինստիտուտի եւ Միացյալ Նահանգներում այդ կենտրոնի գործունեության տնօրեն։ Նա իր դոկտորական աստիճանը ստացել է Georgetown-ի համալսարանից։ Arta, welcome to our program. It's a pleasure to have you.
Glad to be here.
Also, thanks for participating in our conference. I hope it was interesting.
It was very nice, very fantastic. Great speakers and great guests.
And I'm sorry, everybody wants to ask you questions because you're here. They want to take advantage of this opportunity, and everybody wants to know what's going to happen now. The new elections, the new administration. On the one hand, they're saying there will be no war. On the other hand, there was a statement like yesterday saying, well, actually, it's not going to change much. And we have these appointments, very controversial people. They're not really in love with China, not really in love with Iran, but we're saying there's going to be no war. What are we supposed to expect? What do you think in this region and beyond?
Well, I mean, before we get to this region,
Yes.
we have to think about what is happening on the American front. And yes, there is a clash of different views of thinking about U.S. foreign policy. On the one hand, we have the continuity. Doesn't matter who gets in charge. There are a certain class and group of people who want to continue the same kinds of premises, as we call it in IR, globalist, interventionist, liberal internationalist kind of foreign policy. And that kind of doesn't care which administration it is. At the same time, you have Trump, that is the anti-establishment, anti-systemic candidate who has come up to create this kind of a different foreign policy that no longer looks towards war. But yet, he still wants America to win. So there is, I think it's wrong to think of Trump as an isolationist or to think of him as even a very restrained president. He just doesn't like wars. He doesn't want wars and actions and aggressions that doesn't benefit the United States. So that's his version of America first. They marry these two things together through this idea of peace through strength. A sort of muscular foreign policy that is yes, shows a lot of robust, rhetoric about what we want, and at the same time doesn't necessarily end up in wars. So that seems contradictory, and yet it is the belief of many who are coming in with this administration that with that kind of hard stance, they can actually achieve peace. Now, the danger is there's a lot of unexpected escalations. There's always, when you do robust rhetoric, when you do hawkish language, other side responds and you get tit for tats and you get cycles of escalation. So I think with that in mind, we have to look at the appointments, and I think Donald Trump believes that he can change the Biden administration's policies on Ukraine, especially to end the war in Ukraine. I think that is something that he really looks as a legacy building for him. He thinks about the idea of perhaps what to do with North Korea, like we did last time. He thinks a stronger response to China, competing with it economically, strategically, and also to resolve the war in Gaza. Now, how that's going to come about is obviously a question, because there is a distance between some of his own policies and the track record that we know of the ideological candidates, or the ideology of these appointments, for example, Marco Rubio or Mike Waltz. And so Donald Trump seems to believe that they will do what he says, because he is the undisputed winner of the election. He has brought the party of the Republican Party under his wings. So it's almost, when he says something, it should happen. And people have to bend to his will. And yet, personnel is policy. So when you're thinking about what the individuals that you're bringing in, if you're bringing in the like of a John Bolton, yes, you are dealing with someone like you might use him as an attack dog, but at the same time, when you're not engaged with him and you're not on the issues that you don't say no to him, he's going to advance his own policies. And those policies can be very interventionist, very anti-Trumpian even. So I think that's something that we have to see, whether or not the new 2024 Trump administration, the second Trump administration, can learn to control those other agendas. And yet, at the same time, the Republican Party today is a coalition. It has various groups of thinkers with different kinds of priorities. It does have neocons, it does have realists and restrainers that perhaps are more favorable to our kind of discussion, and it has different groups, like people who are more consider themselves pragmatists or prioritists, or various groups. We can talk about that more in detail if you're interested.
Well, I understand. What are the foreign policy priorities for the Trump administration? And I take your point that yes, personnel is policy. So some of these people have a track record of making certain statements about China, about Iran, about the Middle East, and about Ukraine. Now, putting Ukraine aside for a second, there is the issue of China. A lot of them are known China-phobes. And there is a prospect of an economic war if the tariffs are in fact raised. If Trump really is going to take on de-dollarization, he said, if you try to get rid of a dollar, you're not going to deal with us. We're not going to deal with you. And that's the main purpose of Vladimir Putin and BRICS and partly of the Chinese leadership. So there's a prospect of collision there, and some bellicose statements from China saying by 2027 we should be able to take Taiwan by force. So that's kind of dangerous. And then there's this region, well, not this region, the Middle East.
Yeah.
And then there's Ukraine. What are the priorities, and is South Caucasus a priority for this administration?
Well, I mean, for your audience and the interest of your, South Caucasus is not a priority of the U.S. administration. It will not be a Trump administration policy. It will not be even a Biden administration policy. The South Caucasus is just not on the agenda. Armenia is not specifically on the agenda because there are so many other priorities. The main priority of the incoming Trump administration is China. What they believe to be strategic competition with China, it's usually cast as either a new Cold War, containment, great power politics. All of these are terms that are supposed to show that we are in for a long haul against China. Now, the question of whether or not we can have economic rivalries with states like China without engaging in a strategic confrontation with a nuclear state like China, especially over issues like Taiwan, things that should not be the red lines, because it is a red line for them. Now, to move resources, to be able to compete with China, America has been, again, for 20 years, we have been in endless wars everywhere. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, we still have troops in Syria. The disaster in Libya, funding in Ukraine, the amount of money spent on Ukraine, adjusted for inflation, is much higher than it was actually done by the Marshall Plan. It was
higher than the Marshall
Plan, but adjusted by inflation, more than $113 million. Billion dollars, $113 billion. This was a few months ago. So by the time that the new money comes in, the amount that we have spent on Ukraine is much, much higher. And what are we getting for our money, except for the risks of nuclear escalation, the risk of just conventional war, the risk of a world war. So it is very suspect why it is that we do the kinds of things that we do. So the priority, if it is to get to China, we have to not double down on what we have been doing, but retrench, refocus, recalibrate, reorient, and spend and invest on our even defense forces, on U.S. military and other priorities. So I think in that sense we have to move away from, and this is something that you see in the rhetoric of the Trump administration, pulling back from Ukraine, from commitments to Ukraine, from security guarantees to Ukraine, finding first a ceasefire, perhaps a resolution of some point in Ukraine, finding Europeans to pay more for NATO, pushing Europeans to be more responsible for their own defense, so pulling back away from Europe, decentering Europe, and then finding a way to get Israel, which has a lot of supporters in the incoming administration, to a secure sense of self, to solving some of the security concerns of Israel, or helping it to solve it, so that we can also pull back from the Middle East and therefore focus on the main priority area, which is often called Indo-Pacific, but really is Asia-Pacific, surrounding China. So I think no matter who is in charge and what power and what government, and whether it's Democrat or Republican, I think you're seeing this shift towards China. The Biden administration's second half has been actually run by Kurt Campbell, who is a China person, a China expert, a China hawk, a neoliberal China thinker. So the idea is, how do we change and compete to keep America in a way to be able to manage this shift to polycentrism. Some people call it multipolarity, but really it's a much more polycentric regional order. It's the end of unipolarity. So the question that we are seeing now is that when we look at the coalition of Trump, you see various different groups, as I mentioned. On the one hand, you have the neocons, the people who are from the very long time ago basically in charge of US foreign policy. They believe that America should do what it wants, and it can do what it wants, and it can fight everything. You know, there's a movie, Everything Everywhere All at Once. That's the model of this group. We will counter Russia. We will bloody its nose. We will attack Iran. We will make sure that it doesn't have any nuclear capacity. We will also, contain and curtail China. So I think that's very, very not only idealistic. It is unsound. Is idealistic. It is just not in reality. And those people now, there are members of that ideological faction now in the Trump administration because this is a coalition, and that's what I'm trying to emphasize. And yet, the question that Donald Trump has to think about is that, well, I am the leader of the party, and what I say goes. So even if I put neocons in charge, they will do what I say. So that's number one group everywhere. So all three regions, yes, they're going to use the rhetoric of China, but then they're going to create this, Eurasian alliance of China and Iran and Russia as a way to say that we should fight all of them. Then there is a group that's much more focused on, I call them sort of the Middle East firsters or Iran firsters. Their major interest is, they also use the language of China, but their major focus is on what to do about Iran to get security for Israel. And that group is also willing to leave Ukraine as long as that shift allows for America to be more forceful in its defense of Israel. Because again, this is a question of capability. When we give things that we don't have many of, capabilities that we don't have a lot of, is not infinite, to Ukraine, we're not giving it to Israel. If we're giving it to Israel, we don't have it for Ukraine. So we have to pick and choose. And so from this perspective, we can leave Ukraine, find peace, end the war there, move towards the Middle East, really give a answer to what they believe to be Iran's aggressions, and then from there we will also send a message to China. So that's the second group. Then there's a third group, what we call the pragmatists, or really the prioritizers. They are very close to the realist camp. They just believe that it is not a matter of what we want. Maybe it is, in a perfect world for this group, better to contain and try to deter Iran and Russia. But just we simply cannot do it. So we have to pull back and focus on rebuilding our military, having a better presence, and making sure that China doesn't become more powerful than it is. So for this third group, it is China that should be the focus, and the other two regions just cannot be part of the discussion as much. We have to pull back from them. And then there's a fourth group, what we know as the realists, the restrainers, and my position is closer to this fourth group, which is in general thinking about what is in America's core national interest. What is concretely in America's interest, in the interest of American people? Where is the locus of our attention? Where should that be? And in that, in a way, we think about the domestic issues, the domestic front, to be very front and center. The interests of the people haven't been met for a long time. Billions have been wasted, trillions really. If you look at the over 20 years, more than 8 trillion by some estimates. So when we look at all of the money that has been spent and nothing to show for it, as we talked earlier, you spend all this money and you replace one Taliban with another Taliban. So the argument of realists are, what is in our national interest, and are we actually under threat? And America has a very favorable geography. It is surrounded by oceans. There is no country that can actually compete with it and go to war with it. So America is safe. The question is, the real danger to America comes from its domestic frailties, societal problems, the resentment that exists. The anti-establishment sense is actually being brewed because of this, because people feel they have been ignored and unheard for a long time. So the focus then therefore should be on major major domestic reform, breaking the back of the national security state that was created after 9/11, really tackling the deep state, the business as usual, thinking through why and how we have these alliances that we have. Nobody says not to have an alliance with Europe or European countries, but NATO was an alliance that was created, for example, during the Soviet era. Why can't we think about a new alliance under a different name that actually meets the needs of our time? Why can't we think through how we can pivot to this new world? Because as I have mentioned many times and during these talks, we live in the age of great transition. The world as we know it today is fundamentally different from the world that we knew 20, 30 years ago, even 10 years ago. And because of this, either we learn how to deal with the systemic changes, the structural shifts that are happening around the world, a more diffuse regional order, a more civilizational world, a more multinodal world, or we don't. And if we don't, we're going to diminish our power. We're going to even lose our great power status. And that's something that as an American, no patriotic American should want. So this is the time, and Donald Trump has a mandate to shift priorities and focus on the real issues, and and understand that alliances are not sacred cows. They're not totems of religious sanctity. They are just tools for statecraft and diplomacy. So sometimes there are countries that you make alliances with, and sometimes you make new alliances. And you have to make alliances with the right countries that can actually be self-sufficient, and you want them to be strategically autonomous and self-sufficient. So if you, for example, if we really are worried about China, it is in our interest to make a very clear, and we do have a treaty with Japan. This is actually one of the only countries we have a formal defense pact with. So to help Japan to remilitarize and be that sort of bulwark is very different than if we ask Taiwan to do so, or Ukraine to do so, or Armenia to do so. These are not countries that can actually stand up to the regional powers, great powers, middle powers, as we call it. So again, what I'm trying to suggest is that these four groups have different priorities, different ways of thinking about the world, and yet they're all under the same camp when it comes to the Trump administration.
Well, thank you. This is very thorough. And speaking of these groups, we're told in Armenia that there are some people in the new administration who are very sympathetic to Armenia and who think that there are vital U.S. interests in Armenia. And then on the other hand, I'm hearing that most Americans don't even know where Armenia is. Are you aware of any people who are proposing that the U.S. provide substantial assistance to Armenia, or that who say that there are vital U.S. interests or any interests in Armenia, Caucasus?
The United States has no vital interests in the Middle East, let alone the Caucasus. That's just a reality. And yes, there are certain Americans, maybe very Christian, religious ones, who feel a certain religious affinity with Armenia. But the majority of Americans and majority of don't know where Armenia is or what Armenia does or why we should even know about Armenia. And at the same time, there are many others who know because they're more engaged. They're diplomats or experts who know where Armenia is, but just don't understand why it should be important. The only reason Armenia comes to the question for some in the U.S. administrations, and I'm saying it in plural, is because some believe that Armenia can be used like Georgia was for a while, or Ukraine is today, to bloody Russia's nose. It is not about Armenia. We care only about, as we said repeatedly, we don't care about the Ukrainians. We care about bloodying Russia or giving it quagmires, or and it's the same thing could be said about it doesn't matter if it's Russia. It's not just limited to Russia. Iran could be another one. So we can bolster certain Arab countries so long as they promise to do something to Iran. But in this case, we have Israel, so it's different. But at the same time, finding countries that are no match to relative power speaking. We're speaking the language of interest and power, not morality and ideology. And that's a distinction for this conversation, which I think is important, because I think a lot of times we get lost in the semantics. But it's very important to notice that we look at countries, smaller countries, as a way to just create instability and problems and trouble for the bigger adversaries that we believe that we have. And yet the question is, why do we think that we have those adversaries? And that's something we should really think about.
Well, yes, thank you very much. Speaking of this region, so we have a new U.S. administration coming in, and I take it that, I don't know much about Iran, but I take it that the new leader of Iran is trying to strike a more conciliatory note and is open to dialogue with the United States. At the same time, from what I understand from our previous conversation, there is a certain misunderstanding of the new U.S. leadership. We kind of talked about the U.S. policy towards Iran, but how does Iran see this new administration, and what dynamic could we have between the two rulers, the two governments? Yes. And can we expect maybe more conciliatory policy, or is it going to be more, are we going to go back to the nuclear deal, for example, or is it going to be more of confrontation?
The first thing we need to understand is that Iran is not a monolith. The same way that, we were talking about polarization in different countries, there are schisms between the people of Iran and its government, and then there are factions within the Iranian government that believe different things about what is in Iran's long-term interest and what is in the best interests of regime survival. So Iran, because of that question, the reason Iran has been acting more rationally from an IR perspective is because of those limitations, because regime survival and expediency are in question. So from the Iran perspective, on the one hand, Iran is very unhappy with someone like Trump. The Iranian supreme leader does not understand how a figure like Trump, becomes the leader of a country like America, because, again, the Iranian officials, the Iranian leadership, was really came of age during the height of American power during the Cold War. So they have this sense of deep awe of America. That's why they're that's why they're ideological enemies. You don't. If you thought that it doesn't matter, you wouldn't have done a revolution, right? So the Iranian revolution, before it's an Islamic revolution, it was an anti-Western and anti-American revolution, and this is the one thing that has kept for so long. So from the Iranian perspective, there is this misunderstanding about why and how, almost in a way that they share this with the liberals in America, because they don't understand, the liberals also don't understand what the appeal of Trump, and the Iranians also, the Iranian leaders also don't understand the appeal of Trump. But at the same time, the last time, they thought that he was, he came in, he was all bluster, Donald Trump and John Bolton and H.R. McMaster and Mattis and all these other figures, Mike Pompeo, there was so much bluster. And the JCPOA, which was negotiated over years, was thrown away very quickly. And so from the Iranian perspective, this was disrespectful. There was nothing to negotiate about. 2016, that was Iran's position. But yet, in 2024, the situation is very different. Iran is far more pragmatic because it understands that the situation in the region has changed. It has also made itself more regionally secure from where it was in 2016. That's what Iran learned, because Iran was very isolated diplomatically in 2016. It was all with it had put all of its eggs at the time in making a specific deal, a diplomatic deal with the United States, and then riding on the coattails of that deal. So it thought that it can deal with the United States, bring down the sanctions, deal with the Europeans, and start rebuilding the economy and start having economic development. That was obviously not true, and yet Iran at the time did not make the right diplomatic moves regionally. It had antagonized a lot of its neighbors. And so the move, because of JCPOA and because of the Abraham Accords, the Iranian response actually changed. Iran became very, very cognizant of the fact that it needs to move to bring the region around itself so that it can no longer be isolated against the United States and Israel. So Iran today is, it started the détente with Saudi Arabia, its major enemy or rival in the in the immediate aftermath of the revolution. So it moved from a Cold War to a Cold Peace to a détente, now to an entente. That's a trajectory.
With Saudi Arabia.
With Saudi Arabia. And this is not that Iran could do this in vacuum. Saudi Arabia also decided similar things because of Ukraine, because it saw that it wants to hedge its bets, because it wants to have a multi-aligned foreign policy. It doesn't just want to put all of its eggs in the American basket. Iran also tried to make closer relations with other countries like Turkey, make more defense understanding with Russia and China. Again, Russia is also a historical rival and enemy of Iran. So it's not easy for the Iranians to make these kinds of calculations. And yet they started to make them even more so. Fully believing that maybe Russia will abandon them, so they will have various contingencies, but to move away from a West-centric kind of foreign policy. And yet today, the faction that is back in power in Iran, with the blessing of the supreme leader, Pezeshkian, Javad Zarif, the former foreign minister, Arakchi, the foreign minister, today's foreign minister, and even Ali Larijani, who just went to Syria and delivered the supreme leader's messages. They're part of the reformist camp, basically the Iranian center left, we can call it that. And the reformist camp is much more, again, enamored with international law and rules-based order and liberal international stuff. And so it doesn't want escalation. It wants to find peace, but it wants to do so according to international law and all those kinds of rhetoric of the past, which we're seeing unravel actually. And so, and yet it's the center right and the extreme right of Iran, the hard right of Iran, which is far more, hardcore in its sort of in its foreign policy, in its views in terms of domestic politics, especially. Far more religious in its domestic politic views, that it is far more realistic about what may or may not be possible with the United States, and what kind of other contingencies have to be thought about. So again, there are very different understanding of what to do with America. On the one hand, they want to have they want to have negotiations. They want to open the door to that negotiation. They want to find some sort of bargain. And it seems that the supreme leader has given his blessing to pursuing a diplomatic path. And at the same time, there are the more cynical or skeptical groups who believe that Iran needs to reestablish its deterrence and negotiate. They're very much like the Trump side, negotiate from a position of strength. So again, that's the Iranian calculus. And from the American perspective, there is this belief that Iran needs to be stopped or not get nuclear weapons, but Israel is the one that has to carry that. America does not want to have troops on the ground, does not want to go to war with Iran. Donald Trump does not want new wars. That is the one thing that he has repeatedly promised. It's the one thing probably that he cannot get away with. So that's I think very clear. And so, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that America will not be much more hawkish in its rhetoric and move towards even more sanctions, as we love in Washington, sanctions for everyone and everything. You get a sanction, you get a it's the Oprah Winfrey sanctions show, and at the same time, I think it is, and this is again contradictions and dilemmas, right? That's what we're talking about. Sanctions might make you sound strong and make you feel good, and at the same time, they advance and accelerate de-dollarization. The very thing that you're trying to avoid. And by the way, Donald Trump acknowledged that during his speeches in the campaign. He said that to various groups, to businessmen and others, that we cannot just throw sanctions on people. And yet, I wonder if the people that, some of whom will come as principals, running the State Department or Treasury or other places, understand this very simple fact that sanctions are first of all very ineffective, help the other side, and destroy your credibility in the long run, your economic and financial viability, which is what the American economy, and not only the economic success, but therefore the strategic and military success depends on. So we just had recently that, and it's not like, China is also playing this smart, because China is not saying, okay, we're going to leave the dollar tomorrow. What is China doing? China is basically, recently it just offered $2 billion in backed loan securities, and U.S. denominated in Saudi Arabia. And it offered them in the same rate as a very close rate as the U.S. Treasury would. So China is at an economic place that it can compete with the United States for bonds, giving bonds to other countries, and basically it has all of this dollar and is using to buy these other countries' debts, and it's using the dollar to move away from the sanctions. Which is again, this might be a transitory stage, but it shows that even it's all based on trust, and if even China itself can use the dollar to its advantage, because America is just not on its game.
I understand. One curious thing, I wanted to discuss Russia, Iran, and the Caucasus, but before we get there, a curious thing that comes to mind, here we're taught by a lot of propagandists that are funded by certain organizations that you know, that Russia bad, West good. West equals democracy, equals color revolutions, democratic revolutions, human rights. Russia is autocracy. Putin is Satan. They demonize him, and it interferes in all these countries to install autocratic regimes. And yet Iran had a curious case in the 50s, I take it, when you had Mogadek was his name? Mossadegh. He was elected, he was a popularly elected democratic leader,
yes.
And then he was replaced by the US and Britain, and they installed a not so democratic leader, if I may say so. I mean, I don't know enough about it. Perhaps you could briefly tell me what happened.
Sure. I mean, the whole idea of democracy versus autocracy is a made-up idea, is a modern idea, is a very contemporary idea. Even during the early years of the Cold War, for example, Portugal was a founding member of NATO. Who was running Portugal at the time? Salazar, who was a fascist. So this is a myth. The idea that the religion that they have made out of democracy, liberal democracy as a religion, is a relatively recent development that didn't even exist during the entirety of the Cold War. And it is a way to demonize the other side and say that you are basically righteous warriors. In a Manichaean struggle, a quest for righteousness. I mean, this is very religious language, really. It is very messianic. We are going to save the world. We are going to defend. We're going to defend the boundaries of sanity. And this is another thing. You hear this word civilization used in the singular. We're going to defend civilization from barbarians. And barbarians are who? Russians, Iranians, the Chinese. These are states of thousands of years of civilizations, but there are barbarians in the West. But to answer the question very quickly, in the Iranian case, the context was the Cold War. Britain was losing its entrenched interest in Iran, and it sort of concocted a crisis, and it went to the big daddy, the United States, and basically manipulated and convinced Eisenhower to interfere in Iranian politics by thinking through this idea of, by running this, what would have been the propaganda at the time, that Mossadegh is a lefty and therefore he is a communist. He's going to hand Iran over, effectively, a nationalist democratic leader, because he has some socialist economic policies and he wants to nationalize oil. He's going to hand over the keys of Iran to the Soviet Union, which is preposterous. This was never on the cards. It was exaggerated. Mossadegh didn't even like the Tudeh party, the Communist Party of Iran. But had to work with certain elements of it because there was a coalition. That's how democracy worked, and also because the Americans and the British had basically shunned his government. So yes, the CIA spent at the time $1 million to try to bring down Mossadegh's government, and
he was a democratically elected leader.
He was a democratically elected leader, and once this happened. Again, I don't. Also, it's very interesting to note that this is beside maybe some of the interest of the audience, but in 1953, The coup certainly happened, but it happened when the Americans themselves thought the coup had lost, and also Mossadegh was also betrayed by the Islamists that were partly carrying on the torch of nationalization. And so, because they switched by trying to, because they thought he was too secular and too nationalistic, so they wanted to go back to the Shah. So he was betrayed on the domestic front and the foreign front. And it's interesting because this became the fuel for the anti-Western, anti-nationalist, anti-Western and anti-United States, anti-American sentiment in Iran that led to the Islamic Revolution of 1970. So the Islamists later used their own betrayal to get a revolution against the United States.
I understand. Well, it's a curious case. Finally, coming to this region, from what I'm seeing, there is some kind of a rapprochement happening with Russia. I take it that Russia and the Soviet Union had a complicated relationship with Iran. There were times when the relationship was decent. There were times when Iran felt it was misled or betrayed. There were some complaints I heard from my Iranian colleagues. But right now, with Iran becoming part of BRICS, Russia and Iran, I believe, signed a treaty on strategic cooperation. Iran has been, helping Russia in the war in Ukraine, providing certain, weapons to Russia. So, does Iran? What prospects for cooperation do you see between Russia and Iran in this region? Because Iran has said, as Russia did, we don't want any third parties in this region, meaning, of course, the U.S. and the West. So, number one, we don't want them here. Number two, we want to be able to maintain the north-south corridor. We want to be able to trade. We want to integrate into BRICS together. And Iran has also played a role of a deterrent, had been deterring. Sadly, we have a neighbor with whom we have a very complicated relationship, and they had certain plans regarding our southern region. And Iran several times said that any change in borders in our region is unacceptable to Iran. So how do you see the strategic interaction between Russia and Iran, and potential role for Iran in ensuring that there's no further destabilization of our region, and ensuring that the borders in the region remain intact?
Yeah, a lot of questions there, but I'll try to be brief.
Yes.
Iran and Russia do have a very complicated history, as you know. So Iran is not, the Iranian government and the Iranians are not completely enamored by just blind faith in the Russian government. But Western action, U.S. action, when you push people into a corner, you make them actually come together to be able to defend themselves. And I think this is a classic case when it comes to the relationship between Iran and Russia. The more the West, tries to punish Russia and at the same time punish Iran, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And Iran has made gains and advances in drone technology, ballistic missiles technology. Russia has other areas of strength to this day, in the jet fighters and air defense systems, and so this looks to be a fruitful defense relationship in which both of their flaws are covered by the other, right? And so they can become more formidable together and stronger. And they're doing naval exercises. They're doing various kinds of trade and military deals, and at the same time, again. The question is, we keep saying that there is this Eurasian alliance of China, Iran, Russia, all the evils, all the autocrats. Is that really would have really happened? Would this really happen if it wasn't for our action, our interventionism, our disregard for reality and the facts, our constant distortive effect and frankly destabilizing effect on these regions? It has pushed these countries together. If the United States wasn't involved, perhaps the older rivalries between Iran and Turkey, Iran and Russia, Russia and Turkey, Russia and China, China and India, all these would come back in. And yet, because the West is so ideological to this day, it makes other countries that are just simply acting out of their national interest, out of their interest in the first place, more closely bounded together. Now, in regards to the southern regions, what we have to mention is the closer relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. Again, from the Iranian perspective, It would have been different if Israel wanted to be a simple country in the regional security architecture of the Middle East. But Israel has been so closely tied with the United States that from the Iranian perspective, considering the Western kind of ideology, considering the anti-colonial, anti-imperial ideology that drove the revolution, Israel is a proxy for the United States in the region. And Iran has not accepted that the United States has any claim or right to be in the region. That the United States does not belong in the region, it is thousands of miles away, and it should go back where it is. And at the same time, Israel is that basically American base that will always be here. So from the Iranian perspective, there will always be a problem, a strategic insecurity when it comes to Israel. And I don't think this is, the Islamic Republic and the Islamic Revolution has ideologized this as part of its own appeal. But I don't think even if you get a nationalist Iranian government, if you get a monarchist Iranian government, that Israel will all of a sudden just be no problem for Iran. And I think we're seeing this because we're also seeing it in the Arab world. We're seeing how for the first time the Arab world is not knowing exactly how to react with Israel, even though they're the allies of the United States, they're close partners, but they just can't accept the atrocities that are happening or the wars that are just continuing to expand into the West Bank, not only in Gaza, into Lebanon. And so with that in mind, it's creating a kind of a new regional front, a new regional security architecture, at least a security structure that it's putting all of these rival factions together and Israel on one side. And I don't think this is good for the interests of Israel, for the future of Israel, because had Israel just acted out of its own national interest, it would have been far more prudent, far more realist, and the IDF analysis, actually reflects that. It is the political heads like Benjamin Netanyahu that go against the IDF. He just recently even got rid of Defense Minister Gallant because he wasn't compliant enough. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to understand that again, Israel also has its own domestic situation, which is exacerbated and accelerated by American policy. It's almost, it doesn't, it's like, you take a child and you give it a car and you say, just go, without any kind of restraint. And that's irresponsible, that's reckless, that's like throwing a grenade into a region. And this gets us to Azerbaijan and South Caucasus, because Azerbaijan is now a very close ally of Israel as part of its own kind of multi-alignment strategy. And it's not that Azerbaijan wants to necessarily be at war with Iran. It knows the cost of that, but it wants to keep the West happy, keep the Israelis happy, play this mischievous role in that way. And Iran is not having it. Iran has basically threatened Azerbaijan recently because of the retaliatory attacks of Israel on some of its facilities, and Iran believes that some of it came from Azerbaijan.
Oh, there was an argument that it came from Azerbaijan,
yes,
Azeri bases?
Yes. Oh. Not from Azeri bases, but that the Azeri airspace was used, that the Mossad and the jets were using Azeri territory. So all of that means that the region around Iran, whether it's the north of Iraq, Kurdistan, which is another place that Mossad is very active, and in the Azeri region, again, Mossad is active to try to destabilize Iran through what it believes to be ethnic tension by using the Azeris in the north and using the Kurds in the west. And so it has invested a lot in expanding its presence and reach and influence and psychological operation and influence operation in north of Iraq, which is the Kurdish region, the autonomous Kurdish region, Erbil and others, as well as Azerbaijan. And so it is very, very critical for Iran. This is a red line of Iran, that the borders cannot be changed, because the more the borders are changed, it gives not only Azerbaijan a benefit. From the Iranian perspective, it is giving Israel a foothold on the Iranian border. And that's unacceptable. So I think moving forward, the country whose interests most and best align with Armenia's interest of not being dragged one side to or another, but also needs to protect its own sovereignty, is Iran.
And another issue, as you know, is this corridor through our territory. Iran is categorically against it. Russia is saying it will be your territory, but we will supervise, we will escort the cargo. Turkey and Azerbaijan want it to be extraterritorial, meaning there's no customs control. And Iran is categorically against it, and there are reasons to believe, there are some statements that basically this is a way of slowly joining Azerbaijan and Turkey. Now, provided that Turkey is a NATO ally, a NATO member, and Azerbaijan is reforming its armed forces with Turkey's assistance based on NATO standards. So the two countries joining, how does Iran see this? Because if Azerbaijan continues to move towards NATO, it becomes another NATO country at some point. Basically, this means that NATO is going to enter the Caspian Sea basin.
Yeah, I don't think Azerbaijan will or wants to end up in NATO. Again, part of the Azerbaijan strategy is the multi-alignment.
Right.
So they're very formalistically very friendly with Iran. They don't try to antagonize it. They're also, they try to do the same thing with Russia. And yes, they have the relationships with Turkey and Israel, but then look at this relationship between Israel and Turkey. It is breaking down at the same time as, yes, there are certain ties, and Turkey is also doing multi-alignment. So both Turkey and Azerbaijan are conducting effectively what is like multi-aligned, which means also what's seemingly contradictory to outside observers' policies. We push this here for now, and then we see what happens, and then we push in a different direction. Turkey is a member of NATO, and yet it is,
good friend of Russia.
A good friend of Russia.
So is Azerbaijan.
Moving away from, never sanctioning Russia, right?
Yeah.
It didn't do what the Western European countries did. Turkey is allowing for the shipment of gas and oil to Israel, all the while it is condemning Israeli actions as genocide. I mean, again, you see all of these contradictory stances. Partly is because Turkey is also in a kind of domestic transition as to what it wants to be. There is a neo-Ottoman trend. There's also the more kind of like, so there's a nationalist trend, but there's a neo-Ottoman trend that's very important in the, which is different from the pan-Turkic elements. And the neo-Ottoman trend is, these lands, we are the leader of the Sunnis in a way from the Ottoman times, and we need to be able to defend the Muslims, defend the Arabs, defend the in a way the Caliphate, the Ottoman Empire. And so the region that all the atrocity is happening is the historical territory and areas of the Ottoman Empire. That's very important, I think, to consider. So yes, I don't think Azerbaijan will become part of NATO, but at the same time, I think Azerbaijan is trying to do this game of being close with the West. It gets a lot of benefit from military and defense benefits from Israel and Israeli technology. It also doesn't want to openly antagonize Iran, and yet there are, again, as I mentioned, there's the sort of the more left reformist camp in Iran, and there's more conservative hard right faction, and the hard right faction is positively angry about Azerbaijan's positions because from their position, what kind of Muslims are you? Are allowing a genocidal state from their perspective to be on the northern border. You're basically undercutting our sovereignty, and you are fomenting discord. So I think there is from Azerbaijan's perspective, it makes sense because it gets certain benefits, and it believes that it doesn't pay a high cost. I think Iran wants to change that low cost calculation for Azerbaijan if it continues down that path. And at the same time, any change to the status quo of the Caucasus is unacceptable for Iran, because Iran sees any change in the status quo in the borders and corridors and everything as a win, not for Azerbaijan and Turkey necessarily, but for Israel. So I think that is something to be kept in mind.
All right. And my final question, you already mentioned Central Asia. As you know, there are a lot of geopolitical processes taking place in Central Asia. There's an increasing Chinese influence, there's increasing Turkish influence, there's still some Russian influence, and it's also, as you mentioned, it's an important center for energy resources. There's gas, oil and gas, and one of the Western projects was to create the so-called Middle Corridor from Central Asia through Turkmenistan, to Caspian Sea, to Caucasus, to the West. What role, if any, does Iran play in this project? Is it that it wants to be part of the kind of East-West corridor, or wants to build its own North-South corridor? And how does it compete or not compete in Central Asia with China and Russia?
Well, I mean, Iran has long linkages in Central Asia. Central Asia is the historical, before the advent of the Russians, especially, Central Asia is the land of the cultural space, cultural realm of Iranian civilization, Persian civilization. And so there is a lot of history there. Um, Iran has focused on, by focusing on the sort of Shia religious element, the Shiite question, it has taken its own eye off the ball. It's focused on the West. Again, there's a West orientation in the politics of Iran. There's a West orientation in the politics of Armenia. Mm-hmm. There's a West orientation in the politics of Russia. Even when things are not going so well, mm-hmm. there's this illusion. There is this our interests are secured in the West. So I'm not so. I'm very skeptical. I'm not very optimistic in the sense that Iran will focus specifically on Central Asia. I think Iran, as I mentioned, is focused on the Western front, in West Asia rather than Central Asia, which is actually its own home turf, more home turf. But yes, Iran has immense potential in Central Asia if it wants to use it. But it needs to resolve the Western questions and the Western conflicts before it can switch to the Central Asia question. And at the same time, I mean, yes, the question of energy and corridors is a key element. It's also a key element in the way that this new map of the Middle East, a new idea of the Middle East that Israel has in mind, it's also about sort of how do you get energy resources to the West and Europe. So you have the Central Asian corridor, but there's also the India, Chabahar, north of Iran, to Turkey or through the Caucasus, but usually through Turkey to Russia corridor. So again, Iran and Central Asia have always been the center. The reason they were in the middle of the Silk Road, the center of various different empires had to cross them. So that was the advantage that Iran and Central Asia had: transportation, getting one's idea, being the middleman, either trading it with the other at profit, or changing it and making it better and then selling it sort of an upward profit. So the question is that understanding that region and that placement and that position is something that, yes, it's a big matter of corridors and energy questions. So I think Iran and India, the BRIC countries, Russia, Turkey, they want that route makes much more sense. And yet, what Israel, for example, wants is this route that goes from goes through ports in the Red Sea to Israel, and doesn't cross Iran and completely undercuts basically the Caucasus and Iran and Central Asia, and it goes through Israel. So Israel becomes a port of entry to the West. So that would be a lot of benefit and profit. That, ironically, one of the effects of the October 7th and the wars and the reaction of the Houthis and the fact that the waters around Yemen and the Red Sea are so dangerous now and so unstable, that has put pause on that idea. So one of the arguments that one can make is that one of the things that Israel really needs to do is to eliminate and stabilize and pacify that whole question of Palestine and Gaza and even its detractors among Hezbollah and the Houthis and ultimately what it believes to be the head of octopus, Iran, to be able to get the corridor and the energy and the money. So we talk about strategic questions, we talk about ideological questions, we talk about all these military questions. There's also the very important economic element and incentive that cannot be ignored. But I just think that there is a reason that regions and systems, complex systems, work and function throughout history in the way that they do. It's not that in the ancient world they didn't have ships, but they decided to do the Silk Road and go through the more straight and narrow path. So I think there are a lot of advantages, and I think in a way, because of the changes in the great transition, the end of unipolarity, we are moving towards a world in which what we call BRICS or BRICS Plus needs to cooperate more to the non-West makes 87% of the world population. So it can be a huge force. And now it's being pushed together more by events. And I'll just end by this. The decision of Saudi Arabia to try to hedge and try to be part of a regional conversation, have a diplomatic and military, even military recently, relationship with Iran, being invited to observe and join naval exercises with Iran. I mean, who would have thought? All of this, that's a tectonic shift, far more significant than Abraham Accords. And if it holds, and if Saudi Arabia is doing this because it sees the world moving, it sees India, China, Russia, Iran moving in a direction, and the West being like stubborn children and dragging its feet and just not making any adjustments, not being adaptable to this new reality. And I think reality is something that we should always be very cognizant of and think through and work according to the logic of common sense and realism.
I think that's good advice for all of us. Thank you very much, Arta, for this wonderful conversation. And hageli gerner hishesme vormen khosum ek Dr. Arta Moeini het. Շնորհակալություն.